Greetings and welcome to This is Revolution. My name is Jean Badgelan, in for Jason Miles, who's taking a well-earned rest. And so we have another exciting episode and interview of This is Revolution, where we'll be talking to Platypodalooza of guests with Spencer Leonard and Sunit Singh. We're going to be talking about Salman Rushdie and the Rushdie Affair and what that, what the fate of Salman Rushdie, who was, attacked recently and lost the use of his eye and has been wounded, what the fatwa issued against him and the response of people in the West, what that signaled for the left. So it's a spicy, interesting topic. And before we bring in our guests, I just want to remind people to like and subscribe. It helps the algorithm. And, please feel free to leave a comment. We always love to see your comments, especially the abusive ones. So, your hatred feeds us. So without further ado, let's bring on our platypodes. We have Spencer Leonard and Sunit Singh, who teaches at the University of Chicago and is also one of the, like Spencer, a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. So welcome to the show. How are you guys doing? Feeling you are on the same camera. It looks very warm, cozy, almost intimate and romantic where you're sitting.
Doing great, Gene. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Thanks for having us on, Gene.
Well, thanks for being here. So, Sunit, you wrote this article a few months ago about Salman Rushdie, and Salman Rushdie has been in the news fairly recently because he was in New York, and a young man, run up on stage and stabbed him, and he's been quite severely injured in that attack. He's lost the use of his eye, and it's all it's pretty tragic, his fate. But of course, this was always something that there was at least a theoretical threat of, or has been for many, many years, because Salman Rushdie in the late 80s published a book, The Satanic Verses, and this became somewhat of a cause celeb. And you point out in your article, not just in the Middle East, but in India, which is, ostensibly it's not a Muslim majority country, and it's ostensibly a secular state as well. And that became a major issue of public concern there. And, this book, which was seen as, let's say, blasphemous, led to a very heavy response, which culminated in a certain way with a fatwa from Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the Iranian Revolution, basically giving religious sanction for someone to kill Salman Rushdie. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of your article, you place this in the context of course, like a political battle taking place within the Islamic world, with Saudi Arabia and Iran trying to outdo each other as who is the leader of the Islamic world. And Salman Rushdie kind of becomes collateral damage in that, but there's a lot of other factors playing into that. So for people who don't remember, that's kind of a short rundown of it. But I wanted to ask you to begin with, I think a lot of people today just know Salman Rushdie as like a celebrity, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not really.
Padma Lakshmi's husband.
Yeah, exactly. Major player, a lot of game. But can you tell us a little bit about who he is and why he matters, particularly as a literary figure, and what was the context? What was so offensive about the Satanic Verses, and why was Salman Rushdie writing a book like that in the first place?
Sure. I mean, I think that there are a number of things that I'd like to also respond to by way of your introduction. I mean, the attack itself, I think one of the things that, as a fan of his work, someone who had read him quite seriously, it was shocking to me that the attacker was someone who was 20 some odd years old,
24 years old.
24, someone who would have not been, alive at the time of the controversy. So before we get into sort of what the controversy was, it's quite shocking in that sense that someone who would be motivated to do it, really attempt murder on stage, really based on what he had learned off of YouTube about the affair. And so the ability of the affair to have that kind of traction decades after the original fatwa, and decades after, in a sense, in a way, the fatwa had been kind of dead letter. And Rushdie was living openly in that sense in New York. He had come out of his decade of hiding. He had been living out in the public sphere for the better part of the early 2000s, right? That entire decade. And so it's, quite surprising that the attack took place when it did. I think that's important to note. Who Salman Rushdie is, I mean, Rushdie is a kind of Indo-British writer. He had moved to England as a young student. He went to one of the sort of British public schools, as they were referred to. He's Oxbridge educated. He wrote a really, the Satanic Verses is really the third in a series of novels that began with Midnight's Children, which is really about the failure of post-colonial India and the regimes of post-colonial India since independence from Britain in 1947, and which he followed then with a novel called Shame, about the failures, in a way, of Pakistan on the other side of the line of partition in 1947. And he's navigating all kinds of themes of kind of migration, of kind of the search for a homeland in those novels, and thinking about the failures of those states. The Satanic Verses is definitely the most ambitious was the most ambitious of his novels today at that time. And it's, it's hard to characterize the novel in brief. It's a kind of sweeping tale. At the heart of it is this historical retelling and reimagination of the foundation of Islam. And this is where the title also refers to an episode which is well known in kind of Islamic history, this idea that Muhammad heard verses from that were whispered to him, right? He thought that the archangel Gabriel had whispered these verses in his ear. It turns out that he comes to the conclusion that they were from the devil. And not from the archangel, right? So these are the Satanic Verses, which were thought to lead him. There's some idea of idolatry or worshiping the goddesses that were there in Mecca, the idols that were worshipped there. But I've gotten away from your original question. Forgive me. But heading back to that, right? I mean, this is why the book was thought to be heretical, or really the sin of apostasy was really the one that he was found guilty of by the clerics. I'd say that the history is important, Gene, and actually the fatwa is not the first salvo in the battle over the book, right? In fact, it's the culmination, in fact, of a controversy that had been growing for some months, and it really began in India, which, as you note, is somewhat surprising in that the book wasn't really even widely available in India at the time. It was available as a very expensive hardback imported from Britain, so it would have been prohibitively expensive for most readers. But there was a group of members of parliament who were sufficiently outraged from having heard about the book and its contents.
Right.
And I think that is, the third world kind of origins of the controversy really mark the way that it played out then when it moved to Britain and across the world. And there were networks that these MPs were tied into that are really important, that the controversy, in a sense,
You mean the Indian MPs?
The Indian MPs, right. The Indian MPs who succeeded in getting the book banned within weeks of its publication.
And these MPs, they were members of a small Islamist political party with connection to Islamic civil society and regional international networks. So so they're tapped into a broader transnational Islamic network, but they're also integral in the Indian political system, because even though they're of only a few votes, a few MPs, they're an interest group, and in the maneuverings in the Indian party, in the Indian parliament, Congress wants to get these votes here, so they're both part of this Indian sphere, you would say, heavily involved in the capitalist politics of India.
Indeed.
But at the same time, they have these that they represent a minority group in India, but one that's connected to these quite powerful and wealthy networks, which are connected to quite powerful and wealthy countries, at least vis-a-vis India. So it's an issue coming out of that. Is that a fair characterization of who these people were that were complaining?
Absolutely. And they're members of the opposition party, in fact, in India. And they're headed into a cycle of elections. And this is why the Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, who is the scion of a kind of dynastic family that has ruled India since independence, that's partly why he bows to the pressure. That there are elections looming in India, and he's eager to, as you mark out, sort of bank votes from a certain kind of constituency, or to displace the opposition there. And these MPs have connections not only across the border in Pakistan and Bangladesh with Islamist groups, but also in Britain through this network of the Jamaat-e-Islami, which has sort of local council mosque members, right, in the middle of England, whom he's in touch with, or through this network that they mobilize, that are going to Xerox copies of the book, send them out, fax them, if one can remember what a fax machine is, right, to various embassies and consulates, to really stir up some kind of reaction to the book. And that's how, in a way, it's through that transnational network, as you're marking out, Gene, that the affair becomes an international affair. Otherwise, it would have remained a fairly local controversy in some way.
Right, because why would someone in Iran or Saudi Arabia give a damn what a British Indian Muslim writer has written in a book in English?
And for what it's, if I may, right, his books were well received. Rushdie's books were well received in Iran. And there was no sense that when it was about to be published, that the Satanic Verses wouldn't follow the success of his earlier books for a Farsi speaking audience. They were well reviewed.
Why? I mean, this may be a little bit off topic. Why did these Indian MPs pick up on this issue, of all things? Was there any specific reason, like a vendetta against like who Rushdie was, or it was just one of those things that it was something someone just picked up and it became the kind of lightning rod for like a visceral anger that leads to like violence?
I don't think it was simply a visceral anger, although I'm sure they would have characterized it as such, and did, right?
Mm.
That they were just outraged at the mere
Triggered, very triggered. They were very
trigger
triggered.
would be the day would be the mot du jour, right? That they would have that surely would have used today. Um, it, that they found it deeply offensive, that there was discussion of a harem of prostitutes who have the names of the wives of the prophet, that he tells the story again, right, of the satanic verses. There were many feigned outrages and, about the book. Why India? Or what? There are a number of different reasons. I think Spencer can also weigh in here. India has first of all, it has a number of laws which make giving sort of religious offense a criminal.
And these are colonial era laws as well.
Indeed, dating back to the 1920s, if not earlier. There was a book about the sex life of the prophet that had sparked outrage. Figures like Gandhi had intervened in that controversy. And so there are these colonial era statutes which remain on the books, which make it a punishable offense to give, really kind of, to offend someone else's religious sensibilities.
Right.
And then there's the nature of Indian politics itself, which is marked by there's a peculiar kind of term for the kind of interethnic strife that exists in India. We call it communalism, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's a period of sort of the breakdown of Nehruvian socialism, right? That this is the background in the 1970s, right? The crisis of the Congress Party and the emergency. So this party that Syed, what is it, Shahabuddin is a member of, is the party that was the first to successfully challenge the Congress, which had basically dominated after independence. And, part of that party was also, the party that's in power now, the Hindu chauvinists who are in power now, even though they had roots and, going back to, the assassination of Gandhi and the bloody partition of British India, they were sort of, their sins were cleansed in the baptism of Indira Gandhi's jails during the emergency. And so they had, become a power or a rising force in Indian politics. And there's a kind of a broad renewal of communal violence that, that marked a kind of breakdown of India's claims to secularism, right? Especially as regards the Muslim community, right? The Muslim community in India had been the ones who had deliberately chosen to be a part of secular India rather than joining Pakistan. And that was in the appeal of the Congress was to that kind of constituency of Muslims. What you see over the course of the 1980s is increasingly an appeal to Muslims on the basis of their religious identity, right? So, like, before this was a famous case called the Shah Bano case, I believe in '86, which was basically a woman claiming the rights of an Indian woman, of a Hindu woman, pardon me, in divorce, right? That her husband should have to pay certain support, etc. And the Congress Party came down hard in favor of a kind of Muslim-specific marriage and divorce law that was an appeal to religious Muslims as opposed to secular Muslims. And it was in the name of secularism, right? And it's a kind of an appeal. It's a kind of a parallel to the British story, where secularism is becoming more a matter of a kind of a multi-religious identity. I mean, that would had always been there, and the implications of the colonial era law that you guys just mentioned, it signals that, but it really comes back in a transformed way in the 80s and beyond.
Because outside of the United States, secularism does not mean what Americans think it means. For example, I work on the Republic of Turkey. Turkey is a secular state, but the mosque has always been part of the state, literally run by a government directorate. And when we look at India as a secular state, it seems what we're seeing there is, in this time of crisis, like the kind of end of this post-colonial developmentalist optimistic era, and the kind of economic malaise and crisis of the 70s and 80s, we're seeing appeals to culture to maintain legitimacy of this project, which means it's less enforcing a separation of religious institutions in the state, but rather managing a segmented population of interests that are defined culturally. Like there's a Muslim interest, and and in the name of secularism, to show that we're not chauvinists, we're going to make this kind of cultural appeal to them. So secularism becomes what it was under the colonial regime, which is managing religious sensitivities so that the plebs don't get out of control and start, doing all kinds of shenanigans. Would that be a fair description of what of how this how Indian secularism is developing during this period, or at least the political practice? I'm curious.
I'd mark out that it's really under assault in this period, in the sense that as much as Rajiv Gandhi is willing to sort of entertain these MPs in the way that you're describing, right? He, at the same time, the Congress Party itself is going to make a concerted pitch to try to win, siphon off votes from an ascendant kind of Hindu right. As Spencer was sort of laying out, the Janata Party, which was the party that temporarily displaced the Congress during what was referred to as the period of the emergency, which is effectively martial law, emergency law that was imposed to ensure that Indira Gandhi remained in power. So here was a situation in which those dynamics are quite complex, right? We have a Muslim MP who belongs to the Janata Party, which is a predominantly Hindu party that is in the opposition. And so Congress is now doing more than one thing, right? It's trying to win over Muslim votes by censoring the book, but also playing, if I may, sort of footsie with the kind of Hindu majoritarianism that is ascendant.
So they're not just making appeals to, they have a kind of contradictory, self-defeating policy where they're both trying to appeal to conservative Muslim sensibilities, while simultaneously trying to do the same thing towards Hindus, which is, that kind of double game is something that states do all the time, and the way that they address different populations and things like that. But we're seeing this kind of like the Congress Party is feeding into this decline of this transformation of secularism into religious sensitivity management.
Indeed, and for what it's worth, when Rajiv Gandhi, who was the prime minister, right, he comes to power after his mother is assassinated, and she was assassinated when there was a kind of Sikh separatist movement in the north. I was a child growing up in India at the time. I mean, I lived through the anti-Sikh pogroms, which were led by the Congress Party.
Right. This was probably the biggest sort of meltdown of Congress Party secularism, because on the one hand they're struggling, they're trying to quash a separatist movement which is fanatical and has all sorts of problems. But as a result of the brutality of that and the kind of ham-fistedness of that, Indira Gandhi's assassinated by her own Sikh bodyguards.
Yeah.
And then what is a very bizarre and kind of subterranean prejudice against Sikhs explodes in, as Sunit says, in the pogroms after Indira Gandhi's assassination in 1984. And that's what catapulted Rajiv Gandhi, her son, who was a very reluctant politician, into power, was simply the fact that he was the son of his mother. And so, yeah, and of course, out of all of this conflict, is going to start to emerge the neoliberalization of India, right? The transformation of the kind of policy character of the state as far as international capital is concerned.
So this is to try and move the conversation on a little bit. This is what you mean by the third world origin of the Salman Rushdie affair. It's not just something that's germane to Britain or the Western public. It's not a Western, or it's not a first world issue, as it were. It is something that is profoundly rooted in the social and political history of India specifically, and it spreads out and has implications beyond that because of these networks that spread out into Pakistan and into Britain, of course.
Indeed, and they are. So it spreads to Pakistan very quickly, to Bangladesh, and these networks are, of course, as you were marking out, Gene, transnational, right? And they're financed by the Saudis. And so, indeed, but the Saudis take it they take an approach which is sort of behind the scenes, right? They're looking to have the book quashed by setting up a sort of action committee in Britain. They are looking to sort of have it reviewed negatively. The kind of furor over the book really develops over time. And the Iranians, in a way, are seeking, as I mark out, and you alluded to, sort of to take the leading role in away from the Saudis, in a way.
So yeah, so
behind it, there is a school, if you will, of modern Muslim fundamentalism, coming from Maududi, who's a massive font of kind of political theology in the 20th century, that's comparable or even more influential than something like Qutb in Egypt. So in that sense, it's not just a South Asia story, right? It really is a story of at least Sunni Islam, and obviously there's a conflict there with Ayatollah, as Sunit just suggested, is of course stealing that thunder, but I would imagine that Khomeini would have been familiar with Maududi even.
Sure.
But it is fascinating that you have all these different vectors that collide in India and propel this to be an issue that has, implications for Indian politics, implications for British politics, and implications for politics across the Islamic world by becoming a kind of it's almost it's an issue and a non-issue. It's like there's no cost for a state to like say something against this. This is good propaganda, as it were. It's like an easy win, and it's kind of like a game of chicken for the leaders of the two countries that are vying not just for political control, but have a kind of theological dimension to it. Sunni, ultra-Orthodox, Wahhabist Saudi Arabia, and of course the Ajams, the Persians, and their heretical, interpretations of Islam. As we all know, I live under the oppression of the Shia in my house. Shah of Mashhad rules with an iron fist here. But
Mhm.
we have like an international geopolitical conflict,
Indeed.
reinforced by like these theological themes, and then we have this like core celeb kind of public sensitivity issue in India, which becomes just a kind of global phenomena, which the Khomeini fatwa is kind of the ultimate, like you say, culmination of. It's not the beginning of the fair. It's like it's this fruition of what this culture war issue, which is only tangentially related to issues in the West, that is rooted in like this, the questions of Indian independence, decolonization, Islamic reform, modernization, all these networks together, but it becomes global. So I think if
And
people
the
watch
thing
it
about it is, Gene, is that that Salman Rushdie really is the novelist of all of what you're talking about, right? In this era, right? He's a critic, as Sunit said, of like the developmental state and the emergency in India, but he's a celebrator of Indian democracy in Midnight's Children as well.
Right.
And he's deeply attuned to the Islamicization of Pakistan, which is the subject of the second of the trilogies, Shame, which is all about Zia's Pakistan, and is much more scathing than Midnight's Children about Pakistan. And he's aware of of how this echoes and reverberates in Europe, where he's living, which is it's not absent from the pages of the Satanic Verses, by any means.
But what I think if people watching take one thing away from today, I think turning that narrative on its head about what the Salman Rushdie affair was all about. It wasn't like an issue, it wasn't just like a random fatwa out of the blue from Iran versus a British writer. It was something that was that we have to turn on its head. We have to flip the narrative around and see it as something that's profoundly rooted in this in decolonization and in the global South, as opposed to be and something that's come to affect people in the West, and not some Western interest issue.
I think that one thing that I would mark out, though, Gene, is that what's took Rushdie by surprise, but is a marked feature and something that I try to bring out in the article, is just the level of support in the West, right? And in fact, to mark out how this becomes an issue in Britain, particularly, but also in Canada, also in other places, South Africa, and how the left itself really equivocates and shakes on this issue, and doesn't come to the fore simply to defend Rushdie and his right to write a novel. There's always a question of, well, he's a Muslim by birth who has written this novel about his own. He's giving voice. He was seen, as Spencer was marking out, he'd become a kind of cultural critic in Britain of the Thatcherite kind of world, and the kind of the plight of migrants and those from the ex-colonies.
He was a trendy,
he was a leftist novelist. Unlike V.S. Naipaul or someone like that, he was the novelist of the left, right? And at this, but at the same time, someone like Khomeini is counting on leftist support for anti-imperialism, right? That he already knows that the left has been soft, and because he defeated them in Iran, but by implication, the left was extremely muddled on the entire question of the Iranian Revolution throughout the 1980s.
Right. So let's just dial back to that point, just to provide some context. So from your perspective, and obviously, there'll be different perspectives on this, but from your perspective, the correct line for the left, or what a good leftist should do, as like basic leftism. We're not going to get into anything high level, but a basic thing is like freedom of expression, democratic freedoms. Those are something that we've got to defend. Marx was a big fan of those kind of things. And you reject this, if not the history behind it and the intellectual contradictions, but let's say the anti-liberal sentiment that kind of exists on some parts of the left today, which like poo-poo the idea of liberal rights like freedom of speech and don't see them as like super important. Your position as a starting point is, this was something that was the common line in the past amongst most leftists of different flavors to a certain extent. Would that be a fair summation of kind of your jumping off point in raising this critique?
I'd say that in this way, it's the defense of freedom of expression is a basic liberal value that the left inherits from liberalism, as much as it critiques the contradictions of liberalism. This is a value that remains sort of underlying. The equivocations of the left on this issue, right? The actual sort of turning against Rushdie is, in a way, part of what I wanted to mark out. But Rushdie himself, as Spencer was marking out, and I try to do in the piece, but I think goes unnoticed in a lot of commentary on the issue, is that Rushdie himself would have been sympathetic to those who wanted to, in a way, censor the book. Right? He himself agreed, and he says very openly now that he's come around on the issue in a way of freedom of expression, of the First Amendment in particular in the US as it exists, that he supported, for example, the kind of statutes that came out of the race relations bills in Britain, which would allow for a way to sort of hamstring that kind of freedom of expression in the name of cultural sensitivity,
like hate speech laws and things like
hate
that.
speech laws, etc. Right? But they're more capacious than that, right? I mean, in Britain, that hate speech can be something that's actually just insulting someone else, and that kind of defamation, right? He didn't see as a problem, of course, until it would turn on him and became, he could see, once he could see what developed there, right? And it wasn't, I don't want to mark it out as a sort of personal issue, but he came to see the limitations of that perspective that he himself once held.
So what the heck is going on? Like, so you're making the case, that a basic value that was historically held by the left. It's not just a principle that's in the abstract. Something that was basic political practice is, as you say, freedom of expression is a basic liberal value. And as the left, we both critique the way this happens in liberalism, the way it can't be fulfilled in liberalism, and we do it properly. We realize we realize real freedom of expression. And of course, that's like a very vague thing to say, but it's kind of principle that you can say, well, if someone's being attacked for a novel they've written, that seems like not very good, this kind of broad principle we have that we should defend. That's this kind of basic stuff. So why figures in the Labour Party, right? We know what's going on with Rajiv Gandhi. He's doing a dirty bit of politics, playing the communal game, doing what he's got to do to get in power. But why and you highlight names in the British Labour Party, right, at the time. Why, like that sleazebag Keith Vaz. Like I didn't know he was that much of a sleazebag. But you have these various MPs. Some of them are like friendly with Rushdie and are like, "Oh, this sucks. This is terrible." But then they are, at best, kind of equivocating, saying, "Well, it's freedom of expression, but it was a bit, unwise." And then you have people who are outright saying, this is an insult and leveling this discourse, perhaps not arguing any particular legal sanction, but certainly participating in a what could be viewed as perhaps if you view it one way, it's a legitimate expression of people's freedom of expression to be angry at something. On the other hand, people might see it as a form of intimidation against a writer for writing something that has been hyped up for God knows what reasons to inflame opinion. So why is the left capitulating it? Is this political pragmatism, which I think obviously there's probably a part of that, but what is and I think this is perhaps where you can provide a broader perspective. It's not just that the Labour Party is doing some base politics, to win Asian votes in Leicester. You would argue there's a ideological shift that's taking place in a very fundamental level that is leading them to take a different kind of politics to basically reject freedom of expression as a meaningful political value in favor of sensitivity towards what previous generations of leftists would call black reactionaries, the turbaned reactionaries. But with the Iranian Revolution, this is something I know a bit about. You've got that Phil Marshall book, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Iran. You got it's the Harman book, it's the Prophet and the Proletariat. All these things coming back, which are positing Islam as a revolutionary force, which obviously to many leftists in the Middle East would have been it's like saying, I don't know, the United Assemblies of God is going to be the basis of, communism. So, yeah, with that long rambling thing that I just said, do you want to talk about why the left is going, why it's responding in this way?
Well, let me start in on that question. I think Spencer and I will probably both want to say a number of different things. I'll just start by saying that it's not simply a shift that occurs, as a result of the Rushdie crisis or the affair, right? I mean, the Rushdie affair is making manifest profound fragmentation and a profound sea change that had been playing out for decades on the left. And you see this not only in the support for the Iranian Revolution and the mullahs, right? But you see this in Britain over precisely the kinds of a move toward the idea that Britain is a nation of communities, right? And so there's a kind of longer history here about migration patterns after World War II, the failure to Britain from the Commonwealth and the erstwhile colonies, and the failure to sort of integrate and assimilate those workers from the colonies and those migrants who'd settled there. There's the long period of the 70s of a kind of economic decline and crisis in Britain and globally, which leads to the rise of the National Front. And so you have one of the things that I try to mark out in the piece is, there's both an anti-fascist politics and an anti-imperialist politics that is playing out in Britain. And on the left, particularly, the way that the left fractures is to come down on one side or the other. And one of the things that I was trying to complicate there is to mark out that many who ended up historically on the kind of anti-imperialist left began as anti-fascists or went the other way. And what I mean by all of that, of course, is that, there are race riots. There's a confrontation with the National Front, which is the sort of experience of figures like Rushdie in the 70s. And it's giving rise to, or marking out, the inadequacies of the left in dealing with, or having a clear take on how to deal with post-colonial Britain, kind of how to deal with the problems of the disintegration of a kind of industrial society as well, by the 70s and early 80s. And it's there that you start to see, and I try to mark out how different groups responded. And it's not to say that one group had it right or one group had it wrong, but to really mark out that the left's unclear.
Right. So can you elaborate? First of all, you talk about this division between anti-imperialist and anti-fascist, right? Like these two kind of categories that people gravitate to on, and their relationship with what their position is on the Rushdie Affair, right? What's the anti-fascist position on it? What's the anti-imperialist position? Can you perhaps expand upon what you mean by those categories, so that people, what separated what were the fundamental beliefs of the anti-fascist and what the political action should be, and how did that differ from the anti-imperialist, and how did they stand vis-a-vis the Rushdie question?
Maybe I can just sort of frame things a little bit, which is that in capitalism, there's a contradiction between democracy and liberalism. And people are super confused about these things, Gene. So people think that the great defense of free speech is something like John Stuart Mill, right? Whereas really what he's doing is he's defending free speech, certainly, but he's not defending it as a liberal exactly, or at least not as a liberal Democrat, because it's defending it against the mob, right? It's defending it against the criticism, anti-elitism. He's defending the rights of intellectuals and artists to
do unpopular things,
right? And so his book from 1859 on liberty is already expressing the contradiction between liberalism and democracy, and socialism doesn't have an answer to that. It's an awareness of that. It's about consciousness of that, about prosecuting politics, where you're trying to win the battle of democracy. At the same time, you're operating within civil society and exercising all of the rights of liberalism, right? Of assembly, of publication, etc. And in a sense that, when we see the meltdown of the left in the 20th century, a split like anti-imperialism, anti-fascism, which is, of course, goes all the way back into the 20s and 30s, right? The kind of Stalinist zigzag on those questions is really turning on the poles of a liberal assertion of, anti-fascism generally aligns itself with liberalism in a broad sense, right? And anti-imperialism aligns itself with democracy, right?
Right.
What is what are the anti-imperialist movements if not mass democratic movements, right? And that includes the Iranian Revolution and the like, right? So it's really navigating this sort of particular form of this contradiction within capitalism in an age when socialism is really melting down. From a capitalist political perspective, obviously, like the first world had claimed liberalism, right? And so you'll find leftists who make a virtue of limiting free speech or something like that, right? Or apologize for, essentially, communist dictatorship. And especially the United States made a kind of credible, particularly in the absence of a mass socialist party in the United States in the post-World War II era, it made a credible claim to reconcile democracy and liberalism. And we still have this, right? People still believe that there's such a thing as like liberal democracy, that's like a thing rather than the name of a contradiction. And we can talk about how it was contradictory before, but it's clearly melting down,
right,
globally, in the age that it's supposedly triumphing, right? That's the deep irony. Sorry, go ahead.
Sumit, do you want to add
No,
to that?
please go ahead, Gene.
Well, what I was going to kind of try to summarize then is like when we're talking about the anti-fascist position, we're talking about a position where that basically defends Rushdie, right? That it's like these kind of fatwas are like it's Islamic fascism, it's intimidation, and so it's aligning with this liberal value. Whereas in contrast, the anti-imperialists are saying no, like, well, maybe, yeah, freedom of speech is important, but the caveat is the downtrodden, unwashed masses of the third world, their feelings have been hurt by entertainment that, well, Rushdie's not a white man, so we can't say the white man, but like someone making the white man's entertainment is doing something that offends the democratic impulses of the people to protect, basically runs a lot of apologetics for third world nationalism, right? And cultural sensitivity. So the left is kind of divided on that line. One has this kind of democratic impulse of anti-imperialism, which is like, well, all these brown people are offended, and we should take that into account. And then you have the anti-fascists who are aligning basically with the traditional liberal position. Is that a fair summation of what we mean here?
I want to complicate that just a little to say that even in amongst those leftists who would defend the liberal position, there comes to be a split or a kind of contradiction even within their own stance, in that they will come to see over time, there are some who are able to muster when the fatwa is issued, they're able to kind of gird up their loins and say, we should stand with Rushdie.
Who are you thinking of there?
Even the CPGB, for example, the Communist Party of Great Britain, is able to sort of declare that fairly openly, although over time, the question is how they even make sense of their own defense of liberal values, right? They will do so. There's already a split within the CPGB. There's a kind of left faction, which is more sort of clear. It's clearer on why they're defending liberal values. And then there are those who are saying things like, well,
and we're talking about the original CPGB that
yes.
was founded in the 20s, not what exists now, which actually comes out of a remnant
of the left faction.
Of the left faction, the Leninist faction that Sunit's talking about.
They can only sort of understand, they're able to say, well, he was once giving voice to a certain, Rushdie himself was an anti-fascist, right? Or he stood against racism in Britain, and therefore we can defend him. They're a little unclear. What I was going to mark out is that even that anti-fascist defense ends up breaking down on the lines of anti-racism, right? That it comes to be the case because they're defenders of liberal values, and because you, of course, oppose discrimination against migrant groups or religious groups or really anyone, that over time there's a kind of, a somersault on the left, even within those who were defenders of a kind of liberal value, that actually, in the name of anti-racism, you can't be critical of those who are critical of Rushdie.
Right. Because it's not your place, because we've got this, it's all about personal experience, people, standpoint epistemology, which, I always,
like your earlier comments about like secularism in Turkey or in India versus the United States, like maybe it's true. Let's grant that it's true or provisionally around religion, but where you see the interesting slippage is where race becomes religion and religion becomes race, right?
Well,
and
it becomes,
you're talking there about constituencies of capitalist politics, right? And in the United States, you have that in spades,
right?
right?
You do have constituency politics in the United States, no doubt about it. I mean,
that's where it looks like vote bank politics in India or in Turkey, right, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there's always these kind of networks that exist, and functionally, I would, people often talk about ethnicity, nation, sect, religion, as like separate phenomena that like. But what I find interesting about those topics in my own academic work is the function that they play in politics, and the way they often, swap in.
Uh-oh.
Ooh. Can you hear me? Hello? Oh no, have we lost our guests? Oh dear. Well, let's see if we can find our guests again. Please bear with us while we have technical issues. Let me play some audio music for everybody out there. You can never find the audio music when you want to do it. Well, we were just about to get to an exciting point, but it seems I'm going to have to just put the music on for a moment. So please bear with us. Difficulty.
Hi, Gene. Can you hear me? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me? There we go. So I do apologize to everybody listening or watching. We've had a few technical difficulties, but we are back now. We don't know whose internet went down, but I know it wasn't mine because my internet was fine. But we've been talking about Salman Rushdie and the Salman Rushdie affair, and we were before the technical issues and gremlins came in. We were talking about the response of the left to Salman Rushdie, the tensions between the anti-fascist response and the anti-imperialist response to the Rushdie affair, and what this kind of equivocating and the kind of evolution of some of the people on the question, what that meant, what that was signifying. So you were talking about the Communist Party of Great Britain.
Indeed. So I was saying that in there was a split within the Communist Party of Great Britain amongst its kind of between its left faction. They ran a newspaper called The Leninist, and that's really the antecedents of today's CPGB, where figures were around that newspaper. And there they were fairly clear that the left should not cow in the face of accusations of racism. And I wanted to sort of also mark out, right, whereas the sort of mainstream party, the Stalinist party, Moscow aligned still, right, the Soviet Union had not yet collapsed, was much more sensitive to that kind of a charge. Maybe we've been bad on the issue of race. Maybe there's something to be said here about our inability to deal with the migrants in our midst in Britain. But this split that I'm marking out, Gene, is paralleled in other left groups as well, right? So it's not just the CPGB. The Trotskyists too are fairly divided on the issues. One might say that they were perhaps clearer on the contradictions of liberal society, of kind of liberal capitalist politics, the contradictions there on the issues of free speech. But there are those who come down on different sides, even on this issue, who would have called it and referred to themselves as Trotskyists. So you have different groups, the most important of which, of course, in Britain would have been the Socialist Workers' Party, or the SWP. And their position, of course, is the one that I bring under heavy fire in this piece.
And it's from the SWP that you get that book or that pamphlet, The Prophet and the Proletariat, which is a kind of
Chris
Harman's defense of like apologetics for the Islamic Revolution and its revolutionary potential, and is making this argument for, I don't know what you would call it, like cultural respect, like that a kind of rejection of an attempt to reject a racialized notion of enlightenment and universality into something which is perhaps not entirely cultural relativism, but is tending in that kind of direction. The Amartya Sen kind of stuff, like, oh, everybody has their own special way of doing things.
Right. So the SWP becomes the dominant party on the left in Britain.
They were everywhere, man. I that was the only game in town. Then they did all kinds of stuff. They had Respect, I seem to remember at some point, which was
right. Well, that's where you see the real meltdown on this issue, right?
Yeah.
Is in
because they get into bed with the Islamists.
They get into bed with the Islamists during the
Now that's what I call
war on terror, wars
that's what
on
I
terror.
call a popular front.
And I'm trying to mark out the longer history, or the kind of genealogy of that, right? Which is to say that actually a number of those who campaigned against Rushdie, who led the campaigns against Rushdie, actually come out of the SWP, and that's not a coincidence in that sense.
So what are the arguments against him, like specifically these elements of the SWP? What does it mean that, in practical terms, what does it mean for them to be not on the, on the other side of the Rushdie debate? What did that mean? What was their argument for taking that position, and what did that concretely mean in practice?
I think we'd have to really talk about the collapse of the project of socialism globally, right? By this period, right? And there's a lovely book by Kenan Malik, whom I rely on a great deal in the piece that I wrote that I want to mark out for listeners. It's a book called From Fatwa to Jihad, and Malik was himself a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, which is a Trotskyist group, but also a number of other left groups over his long durée on the British left. And he talks
which was expelled from the SWP.
Thank you. Right.
Are they the ones who became spiked? Or am I?
Yes,
indeed,
exactly.
Indeed.
Yeah, they became spiked, didn't they?
So once in the SWP, then involved in the RCP and in a number of kind of anti-racist campaigns.
Living Marxism spiked. Yeah.
Right. And, he narrates sort of how his own comrades from these anti-racism campaigns, for example, for them, it was a fairly short step from the anti-racism campaigns that occurred under the banner of Trotskyism or the left to supporting the anti-Rushdie campaigns, right? That it was in the same way that racism was an assault on them. In the Rushdie had leveled an assault on their values and
on Islam,
on
Islam, whatever that means.
Yeah, and when I say that we have to also attend to the collapse of the project of socialism globally, there is this sense that, as one of the sort of interlocutors that Malik says, he's done with the white left.
Right.
And he's done with selling a newspaper on a corner that nobody really wants to buy.
And you do that's common currency in the language of the left today, the white left, which, I'll say, there may be cases where that, that term might have like some utility. There might be some people who are like really not, there could be a use for that term, but it's become very generalized as right. Like if you just happen to be a pale skin, or not sufficiently ethnic, you are the quote unquote white left, whatever that means. And the parallel, I would say, you also have you have a whole bunch of people, usually white people, complaining online about Westoid Marxists and like true Eastern Marxism. And it's like that, like everything is, everything is caveated with a adjective based on something which is entirely arbitrary, as opposed to it's like it's not even political, it's not ideological. It's not like when the trots are going, you're a trot, or the Stalinists are going, I prefer you to use the term Marxist-Leninist. When that's an ideological fight, however incoherent it becomes at times, and however much the lines kind of blur as time goes on, that's based in some kind of ideological and political tradition. Whereas this notion of a white left and a Westoid Marxism, it substitutes ideology and class for a core periphery dynamic, which, if you squint just enough, can look like a class analysis, but really isn't. There's a kind of valorization of the downtrodden, and there's a higher, the good nations, the white supremacy is inverted now. White is bad, black is good, right? Or there are good countries in the world and bad countries in the world. And if you're an anti-imperialist, all the bad countries in the world, all the good countries in the world, should I say, are those fighting America, and we don't need any explanation. So we're kind of substituting substantial politics for just like very superficial markers of difference. Would you say that's fair, or am I? Because that's where I see you going with this article. That's like how I interpret it through my own particular lens of things. This kind of drift to identity politics, and a rejection of like universal principles like freedom of speech in favor of what really is kind of a right wing worldview, about a right wing view about society, but in progressive garb.
I mean, you can see in one, when Sunit lays this out, and again, to be fair, some of it is broached in Kanan Malik's book, which is the actual segregation of British society that's being sponsored by, above all, the Labour Party, but is being incorporated as part of effectively neoliberal governance under Thatcher. So and this finds all sorts of cultural expressions, but it's literally the case that you're getting like South Asian dominated council housing, right? That you're and this is celebrated as not segregation, but as multiculturalism.
Segregation, but good.
Right. And of course, there are real parallels in the United States that you can see.
Land acknowledgements are blood and soil nationalism, but good, right? Or like, affirmative action, some might argue, is like doing a racism, but good. I mean, literally,
Black nationalism, black nationalism, like the fate of Black Panther Party and becoming like Democratic Party politicians. I mean, we're sitting here in Hyde Park in Chicago. The congressman here was Fred Hampton's lieutenant in the Black Panther Party of Chicago. But in Britain, right, you have all sorts of cultural artifacts like the novels of Hanif Qureshi, but probably far more significant in terms of world culture is Steel Pulse, The Clash, right? All of these rock against racism bands,
yep.
Right? And of course, there's
Bob Geldof,
right? So these are people who are both burning Rushdie's book and going to parties and dancing to Bob Marley. Right? That's the world that this is.
So they're very confused
in the 1980s.
So they're confused because everything's going wrong and they're disorientated.
And then there comes to be this sense, right? Part of what I try to mark out is, there's the rise of these kind of Asian youth movements also, right? So there's a kind of turning away. There are some who reject kind of the left in favor of fundamentalism, but then there are those who also who also reject the left in the name of transcending politics. So they have the adage "no politics," and that they are going to deal with racism somehow as being above politics. So it's the old canard that Marxism or the left was bad on the issue of racism, and that racism can be dealt with separate from the question of socialism. And that sets them up to be, as Spencer was marking out, right? It sets them up to be sort of champions of a certain kind of multiculturalism, of really a kind of neoliberalism, which emphasizes these sort of community groups as being separate but equal in their own way, and the very meaning of equality is supposed to be interpreted in a culturally sensitive and appropriate way, which undermines the very basis of the notion of equality, of course.
Right. And it's this contradiction, that existed not just in the West, but in a lot of societies, where you have simultaneously political projects that seek to obliterate the traditional communal boundaries between people's, segmented interests, but at the same time, those very same tendencies can reinvent the very identities that they were seeking to, you know, transcend in the first days. So you end up with like a secularized
Yes.
version of a religious identity. To go back to the example of Turkey. Turkey was a secular state, but one of the reasons it could become a secular state was because they had eliminated like 20% of the population, and the country was 99% Muslim. So what's the problem with secularism at that point, right? There's no cost to it, right? So, but you have an increasingly secularized notion and essentialist notion of identity, which, I see this in a lot of academic literature. I don't know if you guys agree with me on this. There is a kind of trompe d'oeil that these guys like to play, where they say race is socially constructed, identity is socially constructed, and then proceed to argue, at least in a functional sense, that these identities are like inherent and essential, right? And it takes like, maybe this is a spicy take, a little bit of standpoint and epistemology, a little dash of it is quite useful, because it helps people with different life experiences might come to different conclusions to you. But this has been taken to like an absurd like extreme, where it's not about trying to get different perspectives, but rather trying to replace one narrative with another narrative, which is really the same narrative, just with different. A good example is the fight over of what I mean is the fight over 1619 project, right? Like 1619 project isn't really challenging American exceptionalism or American nationalism. It's just creating like a new national narrative myth, where America like is like uniquely sinful to Black people. So, please give me a endowed chair at Howard University, if that's okay, for this, because my great 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 grandma was a slave. So
it's also of course the whole language of American exceptionalism is nobody's clear about that, right? But one language was America's exceptional because it's not susceptible to socialism, right? That's a canard that completely obscures certainly 19th century socialist history, where the United States is far in advance politically of, say, Britain, in terms of the history of socialism, but or development of socialist parties. But what it's really eliminating, of course, is the exceptional character of the United States foundation and revolution, right? And it's a direct attack on that, because it's 1619, not 1776 and 1863, right? But the larger point that I would make is that socialism is a project of winning the battle of democracy, right? It's obviously, if there are discontents in society because people are being discriminated against, and that's in law, right? If that's in law, then that has to be a part of your politics, or your socialism is bankrupt, right? If there's legal discrimination, if it's in society, then what can you do other than say that an injury to one is an injury to all, right? And assert the solidarity of the working class, right? And that could mean fighting people in the streets or whatever.
And this was
that's a highly degenerate situation.
And this was the impulse behind elements of the left rallying behind Muslims, because they're like, Muslims are a discriminated and oppressed group, maybe not in legal terms, but in social, in the society. And this is an attack on them as a community.
Well, in legal terms, and certainly in England,
Blasphemy laws. Jack Straw, in your article, you mentioned Jack Straw.
That's right.
Good Stalinist.
Yeah, seeking to revive the blasphemy laws and make them more capacious.
In order to do this in the name of cultural sensitivity. And in practice, to go back to what we talked about right at the beginning, it goes full back to colonial practice, which the British have brought these blasphemy laws into India in the first place, precisely in order to manage their colonial empire. Except these very same tools, this very same set of legal remedies are being trotted out, but this time in the name of anti-racism and progressive socialism. But it's understandable why.
They enact them in Britain in order to,
protect the minority.
Suppress all kinds of dissent,
right,
including socialism, right? Questioning God, questioning the king.
Hey, don't you just question the king? It's too soon.
Don't question
just the King Charles.
King Charles, the new caliph.
He's the new caliph.
Who would have been a chief proponent of expanding the blasphemy laws. No doubt.
He's defender of not just the faith. He's defender of all faith.
That's right. Defender of faith.
No, I noticed that about the coronation. He's
defender of faith.
There was a Sikh and an imam and a.
Oh really?
Oh yeah, he's fully ready to do a Sultan Jem and combine Judaism, Christianity, and Islam into some kind of new religion. Charles can be the God Emperor, and we can revive Anglicanism. And at the same time, in America, you guys can all become Mormons because that's the purest American religion. A true patriot, a true American is a Mormon. Anyway, with that aside, the impulse then to rally against the old school left position of protecting this democratic, the right of Rushdie to express himself, was caught up in this other, great issue, the question of decolonization, anti-racism, anti-imperialism, and the desire of elements of the left to perhaps maybe overcorrect for some of their previous positions, which perhaps had not been sensitive to the position of national and ethnic minorities. It's the influence of I guess in the United States, that very boring book, which I'm going to admit I didn't finish because it was boring, the Black Marxism book. It was very written not good, right? I will say that, written not good at all. And I'm not, but this kind of thing, which is whipping up this notion that, well, it's super edgy to
don't disavow your entire generation. Your generation, I thought, was so illiterate that they didn't care about such things as poorly written books. Isn't that? I mean, that book is like the darling of all the academics.
Come on,
now,
you guys must the platypodes must have read that book. That sounds like something that would be read.
Right. I'm just saying, don't
read
complaining about poorly written books. Right, that's.
That's
pretty old.
Is that old? Is that old school? A lot of books are. Just let's just digress for a moment to comment on actually how so many academic books are actually not very well written or not very engagingly written.
I mean, it doesn't apply only to academic books. Frankly, things that we think of as literature, right? What makes some of the new literature that speaks to...
Oh, you don't like Harry Potter? Is that what you're telling me?
I quite like Harry. That's all right. There's a fair bit of classicism involved there, but but I'm saying the kinds of things, there were always these critiques, for example, of Rushdie, right? If you didn't really want to engage, you would just say that, this is bad fiction, that this is poorly written. Right, where actually there's a level of mastery and command of English, of classical references, of deeply literate insights, and there's a kind of Philistinism to the left on the present, which will admire books that are manifestly horrible as works of art.
Like what would you come on, name names. You can't just throw that out there. What books are terrible that people should feel ashamed of liking?
Settlers.
Oh, the what's that guy called? Who wrote Settlers? It's like America Bad because Settlers, right?
Yeah,
Shaky.
God, the list is so long.
The
Gene.
list is long, Gene. I mean,
Come on, give us some of the highlights. What are on the bad? What's on the Spencer bad list? And what's on this?
Robin Kelly,
Robin.
is pretty insufferable. I mean, Jesus, I don't read these books anymore. And I don't want to diss on people, but
yeah,
it's I mean, everything that people read is largely crap. But and there's a notion that like good new books are better, right? This is like fantasy. But what I was going to say about Rushdie is you don't have to believe that Rushdie is like the great voice of the last quarter of the 20th century, right? He's just a manifestly good writer.
I read
whether he's a great writer or not is up to literary critics, and I could debate
it's up to
that.
people's personal
we
preferences.
can all debate it, But the idea that it's not good literature is kind of absurd. He obviously deserves to make his living by the pen as he does, and the idea is, what I would say is that the criticism of Rushdie is also what garnered him so much praise, right. Which is that people, when they give him the Booker of Bookers and so forth, they're giving him that not because of the quality of the literature. And I don't mean in a formalistic
They're
sense.
giving him a consolation prize for having to live in a box for 10 years. Is that what you said?
Well, they give it to him. They give it to him because they like the politics, right? They like what they think the politics is. Like I said, I mean,
which I've read.
He is the darling novelist of the left.
I've read Midnight's. I've read Midnight's Children. That's the only one that I've read from him, and it's not exactly the type of book that I like, but I can appreciate this is obviously like a well-written book and a guy who knows, because I am a proud Philistine, but I know enough to know that I'm a proud Philistine. But it's also
he has a Philistine streak, right? He wanted to be a science fiction writer,
kind of. There's a
and those are people who tend to be like novels of ideas, rather than
he's imaginative,
precious about literature.
He's imaginative. It's like his writing is imaginative, but also it has a type of politics that people can imbue. It's like a Rorschach of politics. It's this. It's you said at the beginning. It's a kind of like left liberal, democratic optimism. It's like it's terrible, but deep down they're all just deep down. Rushdie's a Whig who thinks at the end of the day it's going to get better, right?
He's a comic writer, I would say. He's very lighthearted, and he's super playful. Right, especially if you know Urdu, right, which is the punning on Indian languages in English. I mean, it's masterful, and it's path breaking. There's no doubt about it. He's had there's dozens of imitators in that respect. And he just obviously has that kind of mind that he just loves to entertain himself with wordplay and the like. So in that sense, it's a loss. People don't read to be amused, right? Like the idea of the great comic novel, right? I think people don't read, like Evelyn Waugh or P.G. Woodhouse or
why would you read it when you can watch PG? You can watch Jeeves and Wooster. It's got what's his name in it? It's got Stephen Fry, and Hugh Laurie. It's one of the two really good novel series adaptations. My two favorite novel series adaptations: the P.G. Woodhouse TV series. I think that was really well done. And the Poirot TV series, the one with Suchet. Yeah, like all these new Poirots they're putting in the movies, the sexy Poirots, I'm like, get those Poirots out of my face. You know, it's Suchet all the way, ride or die with that. And the PG Warhols, but people don't read those kind of things anymore, I don't think. And it is what it is because tastes change.
They don't understand satire, right? I mean, and that's a lot of what is running through even the satanic.
Yeah, but I don't know what satire is anymore. You know, like I wake up in the morning and I'm like, wait, am I living in satire? You know, it's like I read a lot of science fiction, and I'm like, we're just in this dystopian future, except it's like there's fewer neon lights, and it's just more boring. And
this is what really offended Muslims, right? What really offended Muslims is that Rushdie's irreverent.
Yeah.
Right. It's super irreverent.
And in a way, that's what the left also, right? I would just mark out that in their response to Rushdie, it was while he was a member of the tribe who was trying to, it's a mealy-mouthed defense.
Yeah, it was
because
I picked that up from what you were saying, was that, even those two were defending him because you said earlier, because he had the right politics, or because he's a brown person and brown people are allowed to write about other brown people. This wouldn't be the same. But it's all focused on who Rushdie is, either as a political animal or his kind of innate racial characteristics that make him worthy of the defense, and not the fundamental principle of freedom of expression. Like, so they're doing they're doing the defense, but on the wrong ground. Like, to draw a parallel with my anti-imperialism article, people might be right to oppose imperialism, but they're doing it on a shaky ground, which you move a few pegs and it just all comes tumbling down, and you end up in being muddled up.
Right. And so you see this really marked in the way that the left responds to Rushdie. I mean, either they see his kind of ardent defense of freedom of expression now, the position that he's come to, as itself a move to the right, and in this way they club him in with his comrade and friend, Christopher Hitchens. Yeah. And they seek to distinguish the right of Rushdie to write a novel like The Satanic Verses from, say, those who drew the Danish cartoons.
Right. Which is, again...
Right. Or Charlie Hebdo reprinting...
all kinds of stuff which are fabricated crises that get picked up, and then the left gets drawn into this kind of trap, as it were.
And there's a larger, I was thinking about the diss on academia. They say, sorry for being a little bit digressive, but they say that they're worried about their students using Chat GPT, but what they're really afraid of is that Chat GPT is going to put them out of business, right? Because there's nothing beyond the literal meaning, right? There's nothing beyond like what the surface level meaning. And this is where, obviously people can't deal with free speech because they don't understand that things can, that you can be saying all sorts of things, and that you may not even, that people may not fully understand their intentions, right? And obviously that's, especially the case with art, that authors aren't necessarily going to be their own best critics.
Right.
And that politics could be, that as Marx says that the substance could go beyond the phrase, right? That you could be trying to prosecute a politics that goes beyond any immediate political goal or policy aim, right? But is really about shifting an entire horizon of possibility on a mass scale. Right, developing the capacities of the working class, like phrases like that. Like, what are we even talking about? Developing historical consciousness. These phrases mean nothing to the left anymore, because they literally have this kind of machine language notion of what communication can be, right? And they have no sense of genre, right? Because you'd have to have that, right? You have to understand the difference between like political agitation and a poem and different genres of novels, like comic novels and fantasy novels, etc. Right? We're living in an age of just, literalism and therefore, kind of everything is reduced to a single common denominator.
Salafi modernity.
And politically deadly.
Well, that's pretty gloomy, guys. I can just hear Spencer just yelling, "Millennials, you're ruining it," with your lack of culture. But yeah, I mean,
who is this kid who stabbed Rushdie? I mean, he may be a Zoomer.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's really like if you think about it, it's amazing. A 24-year-old kid murders, tries to murder a novelist based on a legal document produced by the dead leader of a country hundreds of thousands, thousands of miles away, who is dead and no longer in charge of that country. And that command, that command comes through and operationalizes in New York City. It's a really striking when you think of the sequence of events that have and the tenuous connections. This kid has no connection to any of these things except through YouTube videos. There's no organic. There's no organic connection with any of this issue. It became just lightning rod in the kind of cultural war politics that exists in the Islamic world, which is how everything works.
And they silenced it. I mean, I feel like they silenced the attack on Rushdie.
You think so? I thought it was. Right. I thought it was covered quite a lot. I don't know. I mean,
it was covered,
but it was sort of the attack was covered, right? This had happened,
but that this is tied to some awful history of Islamism, right? That would be racist to say. And so I feel like the media, obviously, like one of the points that Sunit makes is that only the Daily Mail and the New York Post are interested in the story, right? Of where this
and
kid
because
came
it's
from.
Reported by these right-wing elements who may be doing it for their own actually racist reasons.
No doubt.
But then, this is again the typical problem is, just because they're right-wing scumbags doesn't mean they're sometimes not telling the truth, right? You should be cognizant of why they're trying to tell you the truth, but that doesn't change the fundamentals, of the right or wrong of a particular issue, right? So, but I think there's a lot of this guilt by association politics that happens, definitely exacerbated by social media and the role that it plays within, not in broader politics, but within the community of leftists. Right. People like, I see it every day, like academics from SOAS attacking, the guys who run Novara Media for being fascist sympathizers because they spoke to the wrong person on their podcast or didn't challenge them in the way that they wanted to do. And then, like everybody, then you have this whole like notion of political hygiene, which ends up people just live in these tiny little bubbles, which all have, like you say, Spencer, they have thought taboos. They have different sets of thought taboos, but they all have these thought taboos and they never even challenge. And it's just, and anybody who's like associated with the wrong people, they are guilty by association.
They're wise guys protecting their own racket. Academics are.
I mean, like, Kissinger was right. It's pretty low stakes, though, isn't it?
Well, that's
the tragedy of it, because somebody.
I mean, another thing about the attack on Rushdie that's truly shocking is that this kid's attacking the equivalent of his grandfather, right? It's like in the name of Islam, like you're going to attack
But of
like the
course,
most
this because
traditional values.
the
And Islamism's been, obviously had this character, whatever, like my son, the fanatic,
overthrows tradition. Yeah.
is a great
I mean,
exploration
ISIS is
of
the
that.
pure distillation of it.
Short
ISIS
story.
is a pure distillation of it. For 1,400 years, the treasures of Iraq's ancient past existed, surviving the literal initial conquest by the Rashidun caliphs. They survived that, but are destroyed in the name of traditional Islam by a bunch of kids who are taking amphetamines and running basically trafficking in women in the name of Islam, and Islam becomes just a secularized form of quote unquote national identity or group identity or whatever you want to do. So it becomes a kind of Philistine version of what it is as well. It's like nobody's like sitting there seriously considering like questions of the unity of God and all these kind of things. It's just.
And if I may, Gene, right, it goes back to an earlier point. Well, to mark out something about the origins of the Rushdie Affair and the sort of life that it takes on. In that sense, right, it is a modern Western phenomenon, the anti-Rushdie campaign, in that, right, it has its origins in South Asia, the third world, but those who take it on are not speaking in the name of tradition, but actually a rejection of the tradition of their parents, the Islam of their parents. They, in fact, adopt. That's the appeal. That's the kind of globalizing, universalizing appeal of the fundamentalists, that they transcend what their, the kind of cultural politics and Islam of their parents, and can be a part of something that is a global struggle against imperialism.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
racism, in fact, as well, right? So,
yeah, it becomes, what was all these people, leaving Britain and France to go fight in Syria in the name of Islam? What was that but internationalism? A very modern form of politics dressed up in the garb of the 7th century with like it's less a return to tradition and more a modern day LARPing with real guns, like the Dungeons and Dragons people. They all dress up. It's like medieval times. It is Alien versus Predator to the Alien movie. It's not.
It's a LARPing with a very with a death wish.
Oh yeah, it's like hardcore,
right? Deeply nihilistic.
But it is at the end of the day kind of LARPing. Like, the guy called himself Abu Bakr, right? Like they refer to like the West as the Byzantines and like the Sassanids and stuff, and it's like, what are you guys doing? And they're like, running like brothels and rape, and calling it marriages and stuff. It's just all like vice and all kinds of shenanigans, just dressed up in this like. It just looks. It is medieval times, right? It is just.
But it's a disintegration of a kind of capitalist world, right? You see this even with the kind of the recruitment of precisely these kids who went off to fight for the caliphate, but in Britain, how are they recruited to these groups? Hizb al-Tahrir and others, right? Al-Mujahideen, they are all coming out of. Well, they were listening to the rock bands, they were smoking dope, they were doing these other things, and they're kind of cleaning their act up or whatever, but then they just become street gangs.
Yeah, but with a different outfit, right? Less good shoes.
I mean, don't you think that in a sense, like the Islamism aspect of it is exhausted now?
I think at this moment,
I mean, aren't we at a turning point in that respect, that whatever this sort of post-neoliberalism is?
That's such a good question, Spencer, because I don't know. I don't know what your perspectives are, because I think, India is going through a similar dynamic to what the Middle East went through. You had this period in which politics was dominated by, secular nationalist projects, which had varying approaches to religion. Some were more cosmopolitan, some were more ethnocentric, but they were largely these secular projects. And then the Islamists came along as a kind of critique, and that was like the new shiny thing for a while. But like look at Iran today. If you want to secularize a society, give them 40 years of Islamist rule, and you'll secularize it. I think political Islam.
You want to kill off Islam?
Yeah, political Islam. I don't think it's a spent force either, because it has one strength, that it's like deeply organizationally rooted, not just through traditional networks, but through modern organs of civil society. Like it does civil society. It does this. It doesn't just do informal networks. It does proper civil society, actually. So it's very rooted, which I think gives it a kind of like staying power. It always has this like kind of uncomfortable relationship with the existing state powers. Like sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're enemies, and things like that. So I think people are disillusioned, but there is no alternative, right? Like the secular projects are like very anemic and fragile. Turkey's going into elections now, right? What's your choice between? You have like basically Erdogan and his kind of like his version of Islamism, which is basically kind of like World War I era Young Turk politics, like a kind of Turkish nationalist synthesis. Then you have like the remnants of the Kemalists, right? Who are kind of like their project is just doesn't fit to the time anymore, right? And then you have fascists who were upset because they split with the other fascists, and one set of fascists went to the government. What's the alternative? It's like it's not really an alternative. It's like you've got Islamism, or like in India, I guess you have the fascists, the Hindu fascists, right? And then you occasionally have these kind of romantic appeals back to like things used to be better, like in India, like look at all these like ugly looking Hindu like aesthetic types that's like they don't look very modern, they're like offensive to my eyes. In Turkey or in the Middle East, oh, like we used to be so much more modern. Look at this picture of Tehran in 1975. Look at this picture of Baghdad in 1955. This woman had her titties out. Look how progressive they were back then. Like that's the alternative. Like, because there's, I say this all the time on this show, Spencer, and I bet you've heard me say this before. When we watched the thing about Sri Lanka and they broke into the palace and they swam in the pool and they went on the Peloton, they did it, right? They got in the palace, but you got there, and what are you going to do, right? Last nail in the Arab Spring.
The same party came back into power, right?
Look at what happened, we've gone full Arab Spring circle. It's like 1848. It's like
everything seems so. Go ahead, Sunit.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I was only going to mark out that but where you're marking out that there's an absence of an alternative, I think that one has to think about the history of the collapse of the left, and not simply a defeat of the left at the hands of either Erdogan in Turkey, or Thatcher in Britain, or Reagan in the States, right? I mean, it's the self-defeat, the self-collapse of the left,
sure,
where and it's complete merging into, right? We could talk about in Britain the longer sort of history or the legacy of the Rushdie Affair would be, how did someone like Jeremy Corbyn and the politics of multiculturalism play out kind of much more proximally to us? He was hoisted over, the ostensibly similar kinds of issues, right? Of the failure to stamp out anti-Semitism within his own party. You see the kind of politics of respect is just de rigueur across the political spectrum now.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to mediate.
And these things are all go ahead. Jim, sorry.
And it's a difficult one to mediate, because, like, on one hand, for a functioning society, people do have to like show some level of tolerance and respect. You have to put up with things that you might not be comfortable with. And people might have limits to that, like reasonable, like perfectly reasonable limits to that. It's a very difficult thing to navigate politically, which means it's something that you always have to think about and like constantly check yourself. But I guess people see this as kind of like a second order issue, perhaps, like freedom of expression, and the rubric of respect just seems like you're being nice. You know what I mean? You're being nice. Why are you making a big deal about it? Right? Yeah, like technically you have the right to say what you want, but why are you making a big deal? Why are you being racist? Why do you want to be racist? You know, I do have some sympathy with the people who are like want to tap down on some aspects of speech. Like I've seen like I get the impulse.
I know you do,
I
Gene.
get the impulse. Like when you've seen, like in the Middle East, they have Facebook groups where they're like organizing pogroms, right? Those kind of things. You don't want to see those kind of things happen. But I think perhaps we don't discuss like what are the political implications of freedom of speech and how we might personally feel about like when Spencer abuses me over the chat and calls me a millennial and a Stalinist and all these kind of things, and a Philistine, all these things.
That happens in every country, Gene. You don't need to write a free speech to that.
But I might feel sad about.
That's every wife in the world abusing their husbands. That goes on everywhere.
I might feel bad about that, right? But obviously, no one would expect me to censor Spencer. Although if he was at my workplace in the university, he would probably have to go on trial for doing microaggressions on me.
A show trial.
No, I think that we're living in a time when all of these inheritances from the new left, like anti-racism, even feminism, anti-Islamophobia, all of these things are obviously Islamism itself, are exposed to be manifest strategies of capitalist politics, and everyone knows it. Right, the Taliban's running Afghanistan. Like, Islamism runs capitalism. Right, obviously Saudi Arabia.
They're doing a good capitalism.
Iran,
Everybody's doing
everywhere. Turkey, right, and at the same time they don't really mean it. Right, they're not really there's no like elan to these projects. I mean, there's not even elan to Hindutva.
Well,
in India,
it's totally protein. It's totally protein because it can be one in economics policies. It doesn't have any principles, so it can be whatever capitalism wants it to be at a particular moment. It can always compromise, right? It can go and be the neoliberals. It can go and be the state capitalists. Whatever the moment is, because there's no real fundamental principle they have to adhere to. The only thing is a constant churn of a culture war, right? It's like. I don't know what the latest crazy thing in India is, right? I always hear about things with cows, cow police, people getting offended about things, people doing things to cows. In Turkey, I know there's like, 1 week we're going to do this big victory and turn Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Big culture war victory. Everyone gets jacked up for a little bit. Boarded that next one, we're going to make the entire world call the country Turkey and spell it with an umlaut. And that's a victory for anti-imperialism right there for you. But it's this constant culture war. Sometimes it's tangentially related to religion, and sometimes it's kind of a generic conservatism. It's just like there is this kind of generic conservatism, especially in America, right? Where it's like these guys don't really like deeply believe in God, but they don't like gay stuff. They don't like trans people. They think they're gross. They don't like certain lifestyle choices, and they can get swept up along with into the religious politics. But that's not an elan, is it? That's
all levels, right? In Bengali, there's like a phrase that translates basically to like crabs in a bucket, right? That everyone's going to pull everybody else down, right? And so in a place like India, right, like Hindutva amounts to like one miserably poor family manages to get some kind of compensation when the slum gets cleared that they're living in, whereas the Muslim family doesn't, right? Or something like that. It's just people wielding their chains against each other. And at the level of, but when it comes time to like round up the Muslims and put them into, I guess only the Chinese have the stomach for that, actually putting them in camps, that day never seems to come. It's just a menace and a kind of meanness and antisociality that seems to characterize this new epoch of capitalism. That
low
which is
level
why
barbarism.
the pandemic is, I feel like, the ultimate like symbol for it, because it's just like hating other people.
Well, it's like it's a low level barbarism that like I think what you said, like having no Ilan really has a meaning, because it's just the next short term culture war, right? It's like the next outrage issue that'll be they're all interchangeable. Like they're not really, there's nothing to them. And I think that's why I get exhausted with politics, because it's like, what's the next culture war issue that's going to happen, and then everything's going to be about that for 6 months, and then I'm never going to hear about it again.
Yeah, and why do I have to be subjected to so much stress about saying something as simple as, the BLM riots in 2020 were about getting a capitalist politician elected, and that's it, right? If I say that
you can say
at work,
you
I
can
get
say
canceled, right? It's like, what are we talking about anymore? Like the levels of just a cloud of fear and self-censorship.
Well, and it also makes people,
Orwellian, whatever, like the child can't say that the emperor has no clothes. Like no one can point out the naively obvious.
I mean, I don't think it's that bad. I don't know about where you are. I think I do think with the kind of like the progressive cultural authoritarianism issue, I think that's like relevant in like, it's not relevant in society more generally, but I think it is very relevant in academia, in media, and in certain like high end kind of quote unquote PMC arenas where there's like a completely different set of cultural values. Because I do get frustrated with this kind of progressive authoritarianism, but I always try and pull myself back a little bit by trying to get some perspective and say, like, I work in a university. It's going to be like that. And if I was working in my brother works at the docks in the labs, if I worked there, this would not be anything that ever affects my life, right? And I think this part of the culture war gets propelled by people who are in this like media bubble, and they just go bonkers because the culture is so there's such this drive for like cultural conformity. Kuba calls it the drag show on the Death Star. That's what he calls it. It's like it's all happy, but it's all like there's this like disciplining undercurrent, and then you have this kind of,
I agree with you. I don't think that these things like really touch like
regulars, normies,
working class people very much.
But they drive the intelligentsia bonkers. Like, and
obviously the working class is like manifestly more integrated and multiracial, and intermarried and everything else. But they aspire to the middle class. Right. And they see this as, if you're not white, you'll never be able to earn anything anymore because everything's going to be given to you as fulfilling a quota on your route to the middle class, right? From college admissions now to like med school admissions, et cetera. And that breeds a certain resentment. Even my wife will say, do they give me that award? She's full professor, right? Do they give me that award because they think I earned it? Right? or do they give me that award? That's like, there's a deep resentment there. And obviously there's resentment like for white people who feel like something's being taken away from them or they can't earn it, right? It's all, it's not immediate, right? But obviously the middle class is defining the culture. And it is real in the middle class professions, and working class people are always like looking to that for their children and the like. It's a sickness. And it, is it to avoid lawsuits? Is it a way to get people fired? Is it a new form of labor discipline? Like, what is it? It has all sorts of weird functions, but I think in general, the question is just the kind of suffusive misanthropy, right? And lack of solidarity. I really think that people don't understand like what the solidarity of socialism would even look like. Right.
What would it look like, Spencer? You tell me.
Well, they think it's like about class, right? They think it's about like, obviously they think it's like, and they think class is an identity, right? They don't think it's about addressing a task of transforming the future, right? The solidarity that comes out of that, which ultimately isn't a class solidarity, right? Socialism would involve people of different classes, including a lot of middle class people, right? Not only socialist intellectuals, but doctors and lawyers who wanted to devote their time and so forth and so on, right? And it would have to be actually constituted in relation both to a kind of, if you will, horizon of possibility, but also in relation to like a shared understanding of the past, right? Which it's really that brings the solidarity together. It's actually the past that is tasking us to a solidarity that, when we are evading that task to this level of compounded regression, right, is breeding like the deep authoritarianism that I'm bitching about. Sorry.
And that's what the 1619 Project, for example, undoes, right? Is that shared revolutionary history of.
That's what makes it right wing.
Yeah. Well, it's like a massive overcorrection, isn't it? In response to the kind of Disney story that, the Americans, mainstream American nationalists propagated, they just have to just.
But this is where your millennialism's showing, Gene, because that task was already done. I mean, first of all, that was like created by FDR, right? That kind of Americanism, that American Whiggish story, right, was a mid-20th century phenomenon of the welfare state. It was all the new left had done its job. They'd rewritten the textbooks. Nobody's been educated in whatever fantasy of like Jim Crow education for 50 years. Right, you didn't need Hannah Nicole Jones to come along, right?
I don't know if that's. I mean, so this is the thing. I work a lot with in-service teachers and in-service history teachers as well. Like a lot, I spent a lot of time with them. I met many different. And what you're saying, Spencer, about like no one was being taught that fantasy, is like there's a whole lot of people I know who say that. Like, I have a friend who's from Chicago who's like, I don't know what these people are talking about. I was taught all this stuff when I was at high school in Chicago, right? But around these parts, I think the way that some of these things are taught is quite different, not just in the state schools, which I know for a fact.
I sincerely doubt that it's coming from formal schooling.
But a lot of private schools now.
Right. There's a lot
of religious.
I mean, who's teaching? I just don't believe that Missouri isn't. The schools aren't full of a bunch of blue-haired liberal teacher.
I don't think that's the case. I think that's kind of a myth people have about teachers. I think it's a myth perpetrated by both Republicans and to a certain degree Democrats who are in favor of school choice. It's a nice trope to bash the public school system with. But in my experience, the blue-haired teacher is usually the product of is teaching in a district where there's a lot of blue-haired people, right? You go to Nixa, you go to like these places around Springfield, wealthy, like conservative commuter things. Their schools are the political orientation of their teachers, more or less.
If I grant you this premise, it doesn't prove what you want it to prove anyway, because those people aren't going to teach the 1619 project in their schools.
No, they're not. No, like I'm not.
Right.
I'm not in favor of the 1619 project in that sense. What I'm saying is that, why people met 1619 with some sympathy at the beginning. Yes, there might be those who are like adopting this kind of America bad and everything, Whitey is bad and it's all America. It's the counter revolution of 1776 and the counter revolution, like Gerald horning about with his dubious
I mean, but let's be clear, Gene. These are this is a middle class project that is in bed with a new censorship preoccupied authoritarian Democratic Party. That's what it's about. It's not about any kind of correction to anything.
No, I'm not.
right?
I'm not. I see this whole. 60.
It's about ginning up this war against white supremacy in the name of which they're liquidating civil rights for all races and classes in the United States, and setting an example for the world to do the same.
Well,
right? This is seriously right-wing garbage, right? It's not correcting anything.
No, I'm not. What I'm saying is people might meet it with some sympathy because, people might feel there's a need to be, there needs to be a correction. But I'm not saying that these were the corrections that required, because these just, 1619 is basically just saying, like slavery is somehow a uniquely American sin. And if you say like, well, it's not uniquely American.
1619 is saying that the American Revolution, the Civil War, and American socialism are white projects. Right. That's the essence of it. It's got nothing to do with correcting the record on slavery.
And it's
right.
No one was confused
that's what,
when,
in terms of the substance of it, that's why it's right wing. Go ahead, Sunit.
You go ahead. Yeah, please.
I was going to say that no one's actually confused about those dates of what 1619 represented. It's not like original research on.
Yeah, it's like it's a new narrative. And there's a good book by John Hutchinson who writes on nations as zones of conflict, and he's interested at looking at the way that different narratives, within the same nationalist movement, they like recreate narratives. This 1619 project I see as just another iteration of a right-wing American nationalist project. It's just changing the heroes around. It represents, if I was going to be a very vulgar materialist, I would say it represents the growing confidence of a black middle class that
exactly, which is why working class black leaders are excised from it.
So it represents this rising,
whether even in the civil rights movement, right? Even the account of the civil rights movement, to the extent that there is one, right, is all about middle class leadership. Hero.
That's
leadership.
That's what 1619 project. It is. There's America. Biden said it, the soul of America, right? What is that? That's the national narrative. And, the right has a kind of a narrative. The narrative they want to tell you is like the religious one, but because America's like formally a constitutional state, like the formal response, like Trump's 1776 project was kind of just like a joke. But, this, I see 1619 as a attempt to craft a new American nationalist narrative, one with
what end?
With what end? Well, I think I don't think there's necessarily a specific end to it per se. I don't think it's super intentional. I think it's just a reflection of this increasingly self-confident black middle class that has benefited in the post-civil rights era, and they want to have a history that they can write themselves in, not as a side player, as the kind of liberal narrative of like, send me your refugees, and like we have all these, the multicultural American nationalist narrative, instead of them being like a minority, they're the like main players as being like the victims of this empire, but they persevered, and and it becomes a story which gets you an endowed position, right? And I don't blame people for it. It's a shitty job, it's like
it also gets you a tenuously democratic authoritarian technocracy, right? It's rooted in, the author of this politics is the Jim Crow politician Woodrow Wilson, right? Who thought that the U.S. Constitution was a fiction. You could feed it to the masses, but really it was democracy in alliance with the state bureaucracy, right? And this is the rebirth of that. It's the latest form of this essence of the Democratic Party.
Well, that's what me, but
right?
that's
Which is a kind of progressive.
That's what me and the millennials want, Spencer. We want.
I know it is.
We want the state to give me some childcare and some healthcare and to bribe me, right? But they're not bribing me. That's why I'm angry, Spencer. I want to be clear. I'm angry that I'm not getting my bribe, right? Please, capitalism, bribe me, right? I'm begging.
Yeah, I thought that was your whole project, right? You guys were going to push the Democrats to the left.
Well, I wasn't going to push anyone.
I didn't stop you. It's not my fault that.
Well, you know what I would say? What I would say is like this: if it had worked and they bribed me, at least you could say like, "Oh, well, you kind of sold out to the imperialists, but you got some health care. You didn't even get a public option." I'm like, how? Like exactly where we were 9 years ago. So I'm like, people who are still flogging the horse on that. It's like, the door was open. We had a crack at it. But it didn't work. And stop pretending that it worked, because I don't know what.
Hey, you got poverty, censorship, and war.
Well, I think we would have got that anyway, Spencer. That's where I think that was a coming. Whatever was gonna happen. This is my disagreement with you on like, I'm not so sad that Tucker's gone. I just think it's kind of funny. I like watching the like Game of Thrones drama of like how everybody in corporate media hates each other, and so I this is kind of like my Bold and the Beautiful for me, whereas obviously for Spencer, he's a big Tucker fan out there. But my position on the Tucker thing was like, that son of a bitch was like, he was just mad because he's advocating for his China war instead of the Russia. It's like, but we live in a world where leftists are defending their position on Russia.
They're all going to advocate. You're going to have plenty of advocates for the China war, Gene. You're just not going to have anybody criticizing the existing war. He was the one person on national television that was opposing the war that exists. That is, a miserable degradation of geopolitics and an abandonment of all.
Well, it's not like the left is any better at geopolitics. I mean, you have these leftists trying to use.
Well, the left isn't anywhere near the left is a million miles away from geopolitics.
Because you have people. I mean, they're so ignorant. They're like using Mersheimer to justify their positions. But it's like, guys, do you like? And then they get mad at Henry Kissinger. It's like, why are you mad at Henry Kissinger? He's like.
Anybody that's arguing against the war in Ukraine doesn't have any influence at all. Is completely, whatever, they're just grasping at straws. They don't have any influence at all, right? The people who supported the election of Joe Biden have AOC in there defending her votes for war, right? That is the real effect, right? In other words, the real left is the left that liquidated the Democratic Party. Whatever you're talking about is isolated, powerless, pointless ranters like me.
Yeah, but that's all I care about.
I'm going to affect anything who don't have any impact in the world whatsoever.
That is true. I mean, like the Ukraine war really became. I mean, the Ukraine war showed the limits of the Bernie coalition. It exposed. I mean, I think that
wasn't it already apparent?
The Bernie coalition refurbished the military-industrial complex and has given it the license to go to war. Let's be clear about that. This is a war for democracy.
Well,
right?
no, I do
This
say I
is-
do. What I would say is that anti-fascism, as it always ends up being like a narrative thread to turn elements of the left into their like shock troops, whether they want to be the shock troops or not, because anti-fascism became the thread for fighting the Republicans at home, doing the Russia war, and then there's the boogeyman who, in the middle of it all, is Putin, who's like the puppet master of this big fascist movement. For sure, anti-fascism is a vehicle through which the left gets roped into the Democratic Party every time, right? Every time a Tory is elected in Britain, it's always a fascist, right? Like I don't.
Every time a Republican is voted in, they
It's
make
always
the same
it's
claim
always it's so.
in the United States.
We're not going to get rid of the threat of fascism until we finally institute a one-party state, Gene. I mean, come
Well,
on
that's
now.
actually not a bad idea. Like, do you think they'll give me a job? But the Republicans don't make it easy on themselves, do they? It's not like they're doing like stuff which is going to win over the masses, and it does stuff which scares people. Like,
They're just an opposition party of the in
yeah, my
capitalist
bro,
politics.
but like
That's
I live
all.
in Missouri, so it's like a little different over. It feels a little different here with what what goes on.
The Democrats have the broom in some
Yeah.
places, and the Republican,
Yeah.
you got to have an opposition, right? It's
And in
good that there's
Britain,
a
they're not.
They're
even
not.
that.
Come on, they're just two sides of the same coin. I thought it was the duopoly or whatever they call it here. It's the one. There's only one. There's the
party
deep
with-
state. It's the deep state. Anyway, guys.
right. But the fact that they criticize themselves in the struggle for the loaves and fishes of power is opens the possibility for all sorts of critique and information and so forth. Like what we called, bourgeois democracy is better than the alternative. Like obviously, what the left does by supporting the Democrats is they want to undermine that, right? What we want to do is expose the capitalist politics that exists. And for that purpose, the existence of two parties is better than the existence of one party, right? We're not a part of either one, right? But the fact that they're going to leak against each other and they're going to conduct their little congressional hearings against each other, like that's all to the good, right? We should be able to read the Twitter files or read the stuff about the Hunter Biden laptop or read about how the CIA puts its hands on the scales of our politics. And we ought to use it to expose the bankruptcy of the capitalist political order rather than choosing sides and saying, that
Right.
hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil.
Well, that is fair enough. So we've been going for quite a while. I'm going to need to go and assist with the family and get a drink and things. But I want to thank you both for coming and talking about Salman Rushdie and what the Rushdie Affair meant. I appreciate your article. It's going to be in the doobly-doo below. So if people want to read the piece, it's in Sublation Magazine. There'll be a link in the description. And, we'll be doing our usual TIR things, as it were. Spencer, Sunit, do you have anything you wish to announce? Any exciting books to plug or events or talks or anything you guys doing? Anything to report?
For those that aren't aware, Spencer has just put out 2 volumes of Marx's journalism, which includes a fair number of his writings on India and on issues of imperialism and Bonapartism. They're prohibitively expensive, but in hardback form. But
Ask your libraries to get a copy.
Ask your local library.
Ask your libraries and review them widely.
I wanted to just thank you, Gene, because I think that Sunit's article is really outstanding, and it probably should have been addressed over on Sublation. And I'm really glad that you scooped them because it's the fruit of long reflection, and I think it's a really fully realized expression of that.
Well, I hope people.
I was grateful that Sunit asked me on here. Probably would have been better if I wasn't, because he could have gone deeper into some really researching the left issue, what we've been saying, the collapse of the left, and looking at these large scale historical events from the point of view of the disintegration of the left. It's exemplary in that.
Is this what is known in the Catrone zone as the regression theory?
It's also the left-centric view of history. Yes, we got all kinds. That's a really horrible neologism.
I do want to put forward.
But we're averse to the Latin verso. So we have to anglicize.
Fair enough. Well, guys, it's been a real pleasure. I really hope you can come back at some time, Sunit. I've been perusing your academia account, so I've got some other conversations that I may wish to.
We should be on to talk about Fanon or something else, perhaps.
Yes, Sunit's going to be my co-author.
Are you doing the Fanon book?
Yeah. His piece on Fanon is brilliant. That's already out in the world.
Well, maybe we'll do another Fanon episode especially with Pascal in mind, who I'd like to remind viewers, send your thoughts and prayers to Pascal as he recovers. And maybe we will tackle Fanon again. Well,
that may not help his recovery.
No, maybe not. Maybe we'll show it to him when he's feeling a lot better.
Let's do something that'll bring our brother
joy
back to the land of health and life.
And on that pleasant thought, as we say on This Is Revolution, we are out.